All right, so Matt, your question is about using livestock of various kinds in various places for bioremediation to restore function to soil. Is that kind of what you were wondering about?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, right on. Yeah, so um, kind of at the latitude extremes, so real close to the equator where it's super hot, chemical weathering processes are very aggressive. So, like the soil in the Amazon basin is actually super nutrient depleted. It's AlOH3, aluminum ore bauxite, and it's just like bright red oxisol based soil parent. And there's no sodium, there's no magnesium in that in its like worst or purest form, which is why it's a little bit cheaper to get aluminum out of bauxite than like I don't know aluminum silico hydrate or something like that, like we'd find here in the U.S. So where it's really hot, like around the equator, soils get super nutrient depleted because it's easier for rainwater to wash any nutrients that are in the soil uh, out into a river or down into the aquifer or out into the ocean, because the acidity of the water or its ability to dissolve stuff goes up with temperature. So like you might get a burn from an acid, but if it's a boiling hot acid, it's going to be a much worse chemical burn as well as a thermal burn. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right,
for sure.
cool. So that's the low latitude extreme version where you basically you can use livestock to transform vegetate like low value vegetative matter, grasses, stuff like that, into higher value fertilizer in spots, and then spread that and kind of help remediate the soil in that way. Um, it's a careful balance to strike because cattle, you mentioned earlier, um, they it's a very sort of imperfect conversion scheme. So, like when you're making synthetic fertilizers and getting nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, sulfur, all the different organic sort of components of different kinds of fertilizer. Um, when you're controlling that reaction in a factory or a test lab or something like that, you know exactly how much you're putting in, exactly how much you're getting out, and you can enrich it. It can be super concentrated. With bioremediation, it's more of a passive process. Like, you got to eat a whole bunch of plants to turn a whole bunch of plants into fertilizer as a cow, and you get a cow patty from a lot of plants. So it's a tricky balance to strike. You can like overgraze the source fields and deplete those, and then need bioremediation on them too. Um, but done right, it can be very successful. And then at high latitude, it's kind of the opposite problem. Like um, in southern coastal Alaska, where we got beautiful alpine and subalpine forests. Those are also nutrient depleted, but for the opposite reason. It's so cold most of the year that there's not enough biological activity in the soil, microbes, detritivores, transforming dead down matter into available nutrients. That the boreal forest species can actually be kind of starving in the same way. So um, there's a there's a couple of really cool studies that are probably a decade old now that found that for parts of coastal Alaska, in particular around some of the salmon runs up there, um, the primary and like overwhelming nutrient input to those coastal systems is bear poop. So the bears go, eat big old king salmon or something, digest it, poop elsewhere in the woods, and that particular pile of scat, fertilizes several seedlings and gives them enough of a leg up to get any nutrients out of the soil, because it's not that it's dead soil, it's just that it's very, very kind of sleepy soil. It's mostly hibernating throughout the year, just like everything else living. So um, at that end of it, wild animals are doing most of the bioremediation in that case. So yeah, and then in kind of the temperate latitudes in between, you have some options for sure. So no-till farming or low-till farming, um, where you plant cover crops in between seeding your fields for your cash crop and so forth, and then leaving that slash in place or that silage, whatever, after you extract the corn, for example. That helps keep a bunch of carbon at least in the soil. And with industrial farming, you got to add a bunch of those synthetic fertilizers because you're beating the soil as hard as you can to get as much profit out as you can. Industrial farming is pretty intense, but so like the permaculture, intercropping, stuff like that is a great way to get after it as well. Basically, trying to keep as many nutrients in and do the nutrient cycling locally on site instead of having to, you know, if you're like an African yam farmer, like, are you going to buy a truckload of fertilizer from Monsanto? Come on. So they find other ways. Ancient human cultures back in the day, and this is way down the rabbit hole. Um, Social historians have figured out that part of the reason of the rise of what is now modern day China, being basically a continuous civilization for thousands of years, was basically predicated on the idea of using night soil. So instead of animals doing bioremediation, it was animals and people, collecting all of those feces, mixing it with soil to inactivate or outcompete any of the soil pathogens that we'd introduced from our poop. It becomes safe and highly nutrient rich, enriched soil, and they'd spread it on their fields and rice paddies, and they could support much bigger populations on that instead of being nomadic. Um, so yeah, bioremediation isn't just necessarily wildlife either, depending on latitude. It's people too, for sure. So yeah.
Would you say that that is more or less sustainable than like current practices?
Oh, literally anything else is more sustainable than um, fossil fuel based industrial farming. For the reason that we've already hit peak oil, and every barrel we pull out is going to get more and more expensive. Um, so we use petroleum fuels for a nitrogen source and to provide the energy to crack the energy and reaction resistant nitrogen dimer 2-part molecule into like a nitrate fertilizer, um, or like an ammonium nitrate, like super heavy duty nitrogen rich fertilizer. And we're also running out of mineral phosphorus. So there are a couple of places on the entire surface of the earth where it's economically even possible to mine phosphorus rich minerals at the surface, and then process them industrially with a bunch of chemical reactions into a phosphorus or phosphate rich fertilizer. So we're gonna. It depends on the study that you look at, because there's this tiny little island in the Pacific. Like, it's just this one island sticking up out of the ocean, and like the whole island is phosphorus ore. And then there's a bunch of phosphorus ore in Morocco, but it's got a bunch of, I think, sulfate or sulfides in it. It's less high quality. And between those two sources, that's like 95, 99% of the mineral phosphorus that we use like all around the world. Um, so like, for example, the US military has a bunch of war games planned around the idea that, okay, when we like that island is not very big, and we've been hitting it pretty hard for decades, for over a century actually. Um, what happens when that runs out and the entire world's supply of phosphorus is all centered in Morocco? What happens when that becomes like the catalyst for World War III? So when the U.S. military is taking it pretty seriously enough to the point of like planning out scenarios and being like, okay, if this happens, then we respond this way. If that happens, we respond that way. Um, that's a big deal. So because of that intense dependence on fossil fuels and on mineral phosphorus, um, industrial farming, like, it's awesome. It's high profit right now. But when those inputs run out, then you're just back to expecting industrial level output from a non-industrial or synthetically enhanced soil. So from there, again, carbon capturing practices, permaculture, intercropping, stuff like that, it works. And It has for a long time, but it requires some big changes. Like, for example, here in the United States, can you imagine how much people would just lose their minds if, if the town government was like, okay, we need everybody to stop pooping in the toilet. We need you to poop in these buckets so we can process that into night soil. And yeah, maybe we could do this at, sewage processing plants and stuff like that. But we're kind of painted into a corner there. Depending on where you sample, between like 0 and 5% of the dry mass of sewage, so like dried out poop and stuff like that, which would be amazing fertilizer. Um, Up to 5% of that is straight plastic, just like little tiny plastic particles that you can't economically separate out because it's all just organic molecules anyway. Um, and so, you spray a bunch of plastic and fertilizer on your fields, and the plants are uptaking some of that plastic, and some of it's just blowing into your face. And then you're eating those plants, and the plastic molecules are small enough that they go into your organs, and it's a bad deal. So yeah, the less we try to treat the entire planet like a big factory that we can manage perfectly, in my opinion, the better. Um, but that's just me. Great question, man. This is a huge deal. Like this, billions of lives kind of hang in the balance of solving this problem in the next 50 years, right? So we had the green revolution with industrial fertilizers, uh, but the gains from that have really kind of slowed down. And again, that's not a party we can keep celebrating forever, for sure.
So another rabbit hole, while we're on the topic of rabbit holes that I was kind of going down, I found some companies